We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
It's actually Stalinism itself that has prevented so many people from drawing the same conclusions that Lenin drew.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. We discuss pressing issues, highlight current events and active struggles, answer questions, and we bring the lessons of history to the present day. World to Win is hosted by the International Socialist Alternative, an organization made up of sections in more than 30 countries and existing on every continent. We don't just make this show. We're actively organizing in workplaces and communities every day. We're living in an era of one crisis tumbling right into the next, a deadly pandemic into a global depression.
This is a far, far more serious crisis for their system than that.
A global depression into potential climate chaos. Yet, at the same time, we're witnessing a momentous return of the labor movement, of workplace organizing, with more people getting up and getting involved every day.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
We need to rise to meet these new challenges. Tune in every Sunday to hear socialists from across the world talk about what's happening now and where to go next. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternative's YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!
Welcome back, everyone. This is World to Win. My name is Toya with Socialist Alternative in the United States. This week, we're continuing our discussion on Black Lives Matter and the global uprising we're seeing against police brutality. I want to encourage everyone to share this live stream on your social media and even invite your mom. We're finding a lot of moms have something to say about what's going on in the world today. We want engagement with our viewers, so please make sure you're commenting because we're going to get to a point in the show where our panel will be able to answer some of your questions. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So this week we have one returning guest. That's Eric, who's a student in Philadelphia. Hi, Eric. And we have two new guests. First, we have Logan, who is in Seattle and is an ironworker in Local 86. And we have Phemelo from South Africa, who's a member of the Workers' and Socialist Party, which is part of the International Socialist Alternative. Hi, Phemelo.
Hi.
Great, let's get started for this exciting discussion. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing internationally. You know, as we talked about last week, that these protests are not just happening in the US, although, you know, it started with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in the United States. Phemelo, can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing across the world with these protests? Oh, Phemelo, you're on mute.
Oh,
thanks.
Okay, sorry. So this is truly a global movement. You know, almost immediately after the protests broke out in USA, we saw over 100 countries going on protest in support of Black Lives Matters. And, you know, in some countries, we saw even bigger masses, like in Britain, where hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets for 2 weekends in a row, supporting Black Lives Matters. And also the overwhelming presence of the white youth who are in support of Black Lives Matter, is also signaling a change in the demographics of America, because, you know, the new generation is now coming, replacing the old generation that was still stuck with old racist ideologies. And even more uniquely, so a country like Brazil taking to the streets in support of Black Lives Matters because of also their experiences of racism, even despite the fact that they're still in their worst stages of the pandemic. And here in South Africa, we have, on Friday, we had Not In My Name, which is an organization that was formed during the protests of 2019 against femicides, taking to the streets in support of the killing of, fighting for justice for Collins Khosa, who was also murdered by the military during lockdown in his own town. And so, the protest has really sparked a lot of conversation around race around the whole world, and the movement really has won several concessions, and really just breaking the idea that from that we hear from a lot of these other groups or sectors of society that protests don't really do anything, because the matter of George Floyd was arrested, statues that really are representing people who are directly responsible for horrible crimes of racism, being taken down because the government have been saying that they will be forming commissions for years and years. And, truly this movement is showing what is truly possible if we unite. And it's still going on even today. There's still demonstrations every day taking place in cities, and you see on Twitter people sharing hashtags, and the movement is truly growing. And we have to obviously move beyond and do come up with economic demands that are going to, end racism. So I'll come back later on this one. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks so much, Phemelo, for the introduction. Now we're going to show a short video of International Socialist Alternative in action with protests around the world.
Sisters and brothers, my name is L.J. Hawkins. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative New York City. We're here in Harlem, the heart of Black America, protesting the death, the killing of George Floyd, but not just George Floyd, but many, many others before him. And we have to make it very clear that this struggle against racial oppression is also a struggle against economic oppression. So we must stand united and firm on the idea that the only way that we can defeat racial oppression is by defeating economic oppression, and what capitalism has done for working people in this country and around the world.
This incredible movement, this uprising, this rebellion that's not just in Seattle, but nationwide, including in cities like Boise, Idaho, is incredibly inspiring to the vast majority of American people, but it is also threatening to the right wing and the reactionary agenda of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a coward. It's not surprising, but it is horrific for him to threaten entire cities like Seattle and working people and ordinary people and our Black and brown community members who are courageously protesting against police violence.
中共政府以及美国政府都动用了很大规模的催泪弹啊、橡胶子弹啊，这种行径我们可以看到，他们是一样的。
I want to bring full solidarity of our trade union branch to this movement. Our branch today has put out a statement that says, like millions, hundreds of millions around the world, we've looked on with revulsion and anger at the brutal, racist murder of George Floyd. We think that murder is another damning indictment of a deeply racist, oppressive and exploitative capitalist economic system. Nurses, communication workers have also issued solidarity statements in support of the movement, and that needs to go further. We need not just solidarity statements, but mass organised action by organised labour to fight back against racism and capitalism.
My name is Miriam. I'm a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland, and I stand here in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. There's about maybe 1,000 people here standing in solidarity with justice for George Floyd's movement and with all the victims of racist abuse, of violence and murders. Racism, like all other forms of oppression, is still used in the interest of the capitalist elite to divide people and continue to strive for profit. This crisis showed that we run society, not the millionaires, and so we deserve to control it democratically so that inequalities and injustices and oppression can end once and for all.
We should defund the police and also defund the capitalists that they defend. Tax the rich, fund housing, fund healthcare, fund education. Without these things, we cannot breathe.
What we just saw were not simply solidarity protests, but they're actually linked to the idea of institutional oppression globally. Protesters are making connections to the Aboriginals in Australia, to racist policing in the UK, to the violence from the police we're seeing in the favelas in Brazil. Phemelo, could you speak a little more about what is structural racism and how does it manifest itself globally?
Thank you, Toya. I think, right now in South Africa, the main element, rather the core element, would be how the apartheid system, including pre-apartheid system, created a disenfranchised Black working class along racial lines. And there was explicit slavery in the Dutch colony, which shipped people here as Africans were shipped to the UK and USA as slaves. The apartheid system was then geared towards building a cheap Black laboring class through Bantu education, through the creation of townships, also known as ghettos in the US, to stop the mixing of the white elites and the Black working class, and sometimes through outright limiting of career opportunities for Black people. And this is really even still manifesting itself across the whole world. And even now in our democracy, even though racism is not exactly explicit as it is, but because of its role in capitalism, it is manifesting itself structurally. Capitalism depends on the majority to produce its profits and its wealth. So the structural violence that Black people experience here now in our democracy is through structural violence, through forms lack of service delivery in the majority of Black poor communities. Some communities who were disadvantaged by the apartheid practices, lack of affordable healthcare or decent healthcare, and rising levels of malnutrition, which was proven disastrous during this lockdown. We are literally reaching levels of extreme hunger. Also, the pay gaps between Black people and white people, and sometimes outright, limitation of career opportunities, or limiting which courses Black people get into universities, and it is also happening in the USA. And there's absolutely no real commitment from the government to actually fix these issues that came with apartheid, but they're actually being reinforced now because of how they're keeping capitalism alive. We cannot be in a position to expect a rising Black middle class, and so they're trying to keep the majority poor so they can have a huge pool of cheap labor, unlike in the USA, where even after slavery has been abolished now, economically, the fact that slavery was abolished was because it was becoming economically unsustainable. Northern capitalists were scared that they're going to lose their cheap labor force because of the migrant labor that was coming from the South. And therefore they had to really destroy get rid of slavery because it was becoming economically unsustainable. And then they reintroduced, even after slavery, racist policies such as redlining, which where insurance companies made it very difficult for Black people to get home loans because of the areas that they lived in, which were obviously the legacies of segregation of slavery. And also banks charging higher rates for people of color, trying to also prevent Black people or people of color from climbing up the social ladder. So there is a systematic enforcement of some force for a ghettoization of Black communities. And also, as well, as I mentioned, it reveals itself across in the form of wage gaps between people of color and between white people. And, you know, even in airports, when people of color apply for visas, the type of screenings that they have to go through, if you're Muslim, you know, you are a terrorist, and then they literally give you these many, you know, channels for you before you get what you really want. So people of color are disenfranchised in society because of that role that they play in society if they are to be kept disenfranchised as they are. Thanks, comrade.
Thanks so much, Phemelo. You talked a lot there about, you know, capitalism being the problem that causes things like, you know, inadequate healthcare in Black and Brown communities, hunger as an actual issue, wage gaps, and housing discrimination. So I want to go to Eric. Eric, how does, you know, you're a socialist, we're socialists, I'm a socialist. How does the fight for socialism connect to the fight against racism?
Well, I definitely think that one of the most basic prerequisites for fighting for socialism, multiracial, multi-gender working class movement. You can't have one without the other. It's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because we've seen before, especially the history of the United States for 400 years, we've seen racism being used as a tool by the capitalist class to divide the working class. It destroys labor movements. As we see, like, there's never a time where the white unions actually fought. I mean, there's never a time where the white unions actually won any type of big union battle. A lot of the times, the employers employed black scabs who rightfully scabbed because they couldn't join the unions. They wanted to be involved in the labor movement, and the bosses manipulated it and they crushed labor movements. So in order for the working class to win, it must be multiracial, must be multi-gendered. We cannot be divided. And so that's explicitly a fight against racism as well. You can't. It's hard to be racist, but you have to depend on this other person, the person who probably is like, let's say you're a white person and you just don't like black people. It's pretty hard to fight alongside a black person and not develop friendly relations there, because it's like, wait a minute, this is the person I have to fight for my livelihood against the boss who might be the same race as me, looks just like 17. I might even went to high school with this person, but he is against my class interests. And I think also the last thing as well, we have to recognize is that socialism is explicitly against police repression, police terror, recognizing that the police are not just bad people. That's not the problem. The problem is the whole system itself is guilty, that is designed against working people, and socialists wish to fight against that system. So to fight against that system, you must also fight against the ideology of that system, capitalism, which is racism. So the two are like on the same coin. You can't get one without the other. You can't have a racist socialist movement, but also you can't have a truly anti-racist society without socialism.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Eric. Now we're going to watch a quick clip from Belgium. Alan is talking about the need to overcome oppression and division through socialism.
Mais en fait, moi j'ai même envie d'aller plus loin. Malcolm X disait, je pense que c'est ce qu'on a repris ici dans un des tracts ou sur nos t-shirts, on ne peut pas avoir de il ne peut pas y avoir de capitalisme sans racisme. Pourquoi? Parce qu'en fait, la minorité sociale qui s'accapare la production de richesse qui est collective a besoin de diviser pour pouvoir continuer à exploiter la majorité sociale. Et en fait, il y a tout un tas de divisions qui sont mises en place pour pouvoir faire en sorte qu'il n'y ait pas de lutte unifiée contre ce système d'exploitation. Le racisme, ça en est un. La LGBTQI-phobie, le sexisme, tout un tas de divisions qui sont mises, qui sont créées pour pouvoir maintenir le système d'exploitation. Et dans ce sens-là, la police, qui est une des institutions de répression et de sauvegarde du système, a besoin de ces divisions pour pouvoir maintenir l'ordre capitaliste établi.
Hope you enjoyed that clip, but I want to now go to Logan. Logan, just quickly, why does this fight against racism and a fight for for socialism against capitalism, why does this fight need to be global?
I mean, there's only, capitalism is a global system, and there's only one working class. The working class is it's international. It's workers of every color, every gender. It speaks every language, right? And so yeah, like we can't struggle against a global system within the confines of one city or one state or a national boundary. And there's a rich tradition of internationalism, where workers understanding that what happens to that they have more in common. As a union iron worker in Seattle, I've got more in common with an auto worker in Mexico than I do with the major developer that's owns the project that I'm working on. And so yeah, like you've seen historically from dock workers organizing internationally to reject a ship that had been loaded by non-union labor, and the ship just had to go travel around the world as the dock workers organized to not unload it internationally, and eventually had to go back to its home port and be unloaded with union labor, reloaded with union labor before it could get to its port of call. And like that level of solidarity across borders is what it took, right, to make sure that unions were, the workers were being paid fair wages to do that, right? And there's examples going back well over 100 years of internationalism and that kind of solidarity being necessary for us to win our struggles, right? And I think it's especially it's present in workers' minds, right? How companies use exploitation of undocumented workers to drive down wages, right? And it's not in my interest as a construction worker to double down on that discrimination of my brothers and sisters who are being exploited. It's actually in my interest to see their fight as my fight, because it is, and to fight to bring them up to where I'm at, instead of trying to compete with them on the basis that the bosses set, that's on the basis of their exploitation.
Thanks so much, Logan. And it's so true. The ruling class and the capitalists love to use national borders as a way to divide the international working class, ramping up, racism and xenophobia. And it's so important, that solidarity that Logan spoke about. It's super inspiring. I want to shift gears a little bit. We talked, previously before about, how structural racism came to be and the effects that it has today. But I want to hear from Eric, who was on the ground in Minneapolis. I'm not sure. Let us know if you're still there. I'm not sure, but I want to know a little bit more about what's going on there, because we know that's where this current uprising started with the murder of George Floyd. And so I read that the city council in Minneapolis is saying things like they're going to disband the police. This brings up a lot of questions among working class Americans about what public safety will look like. Is that possible? Where will the money go? So can you give us a little update on what's going on in Minneapolis, Eric?
Yeah, sure. And also, I'm back in my hometown of Philadelphia. While I like being in Minneapolis, also like being home way better. And yes, that is true. And we should also pay attention to the background of behind those statements, that there's still protests going on, despite the fact that CNN and MSNBC are not really doing that much coverage of them, or because they don't want to show that working people can actually organize movements for a prolonged period. And that has forced the ruling class, particularly in Minneapolis, through the city council, to make these radical statements. They have now recently but voted on a resolution calling for the dismantle of the MPD. And this resolution is really just happy talk. Their idea of a resolution of dismantling MPD is basically to make a 1-year study via committee with engaged quote unquote community members. And mind you, in big cities, what that means is people that already agree with them, that are a particular race or a particular age, that can say, oh, this person represents, this X community or Y community, but really they represent the interests of City Hall, but they fit the right criteria. And the reason why is that we already seen multiple city council people walk it back. The president of the Minneapolis City Council, and I forget their name, but they have already said that no, this abolishing the police does not mean defunding the police, but also that there will still need to be an armed armed police force for a quote unquote emergency, just like the quote unquote emergency of George Floyd allegedly having a fake $20 bill. And Steve Fletcher's article in Time magazine talking about abolishing the Minneapolis Police Department, he doesn't mention poverty once. His idea is to put social workers in the trenches that they are already in, to tell them to deal with these situations in a system that is meant to cause these situations that social workers have to deal with: poverty, hunger, crime. These things are effects of the system. And his idea is just put money in social workers and make them deal with it. But it doesn't actually address why these things are happening. And we also have to remember the police are there not as social safety, or public safety as they call them. They are forces of poverty. They enforce evictions. They do homeless sweeps. That is what a good cop does. It's a system at play here. But they try to shift the narrative, to delay it and to dilute it by saying, oh, this is an issue of public safety, not good public safety officers. Like, no, this is the issue of poverty. This is the issue of the working class being oppressed by the state through its police force, particularly on Black and brown people, not just because of the color of our skin, but because of the role that we play in the economy as a working class, because they recognize that the Black working class is really a sleeping giant in the United States. And yeah, I think that's really the situation in Minneapolis. The protest is still going on, but people are looking for organization.
Thanks, Eric, for that update. It's super important, making these links to police violence and to poverty. But in the US, we've seen this sort of wave over the past few years, especially with the election of Trump, with these, very left-wing politicians coming to the floor. People like AOC, people like Bernie Sanders, and Ilhan Omar, who is a representative for Congress in Minnesota. Where have they been during all of these protests? And what's your analysis on them and the Democratic Party?
Well, I think it's very well known now the role that Bernie Sanders is playing, basically publicly saying that he is against defunding the police, and actually calls for paying the police more in this argument, saying that if you want better, it's like if you want better workers, then you need to increase the pay to bring the better people, which is a totally capitalist argument. That's not how it works. Just because someone gets paid more doesn't mean the person is better. We know the crimes of people like Jeff Bezos, who puts workers in sweatshop conditions, but he's on his way to be a trillionaire. AOC, while not saying as the things like Bernie Sanders, and posted some solidarity on Twitter, they both have largely been absent of the ground. And they are positioned in this political vacuum where people are looking for organizations to really put out the call for, say, the Bernie Sanders should say that I am in favor of a general strike on June 19th for 8 minutes and 48 seconds, and that the labor movement needs to be involved in this fight. If he would have done so, I guarantee you that hundreds, if not thousands, of labor militants would be pushing for resolutions in their unions, but he is completely absent. And also Ilhan Omar went to Minneapolis. I actually attended one of the rallies in which she spoke, and while she was there, I think she was making a mistake about, she talked about dismantling the MPD, which I think is like, yes, if we could do that, that would be great. But she doesn't mention poverty at all, and she refers to cops as like a quote unquote cancer on the body, I guess, of the United States. But it's not the cops. It's not just the cops. It's capitalism. Capitalism is the cancer, and you can't just get rid of the cops and think you're going to cure cancer. What actually is just one part of the cancer spread to one part of the body. And capitalism makes the whole body of the working class littered with cancer and tumors. And the only way to do it is to get rid of all of it at the source, which is capitalism. So I think she was wrong in her analogy there, and ultimately shows that we really need a revolutionary leadership to step to the fore, that unapologetically fights for the working class, even if the Democratic Party might be mad at you. If they're mad at you, you're probably doing something right.
Thanks, Eric. Now I want to show a clip of a socialist politician who does not simply view the police as, disbanding the police as solving the problem. She herself is a Marxist, a member of the International Socialist Alternative in Seattle, and has been using her seat to really help lead the movement in Seattle against police brutality. So that was a video of Swan letting protesters into City Hall, using her key to help really build this movement and show what the people, when we join together, can do when we build a movement. So I want to go to Logan, who is a Seattle resident working in Seattle. As we know, this autonomous zone has popped up in Seattle in a place called Capitol Hill. They've been calling it Chaz for short. But there's been some criticism about, what this is. Is it co-opting the movement? What are your thoughts, Logan, on this Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone?
Well, yeah, so like the Chaz, as it's called, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, is formed. It's like 6 blocks that are formed around. There's a really large park that's in the center of the district. That's been like a kind of a go-to meetup spot for like protests and demonstrations for years. And yeah, like the Capitol Hill neighborhood is historically like a kind of gay, like artistic, a lot of like musicians and stuff came out of the area. And so like, it's always kind of had like a anti-establishment character. And yeah, like the community college that's in the area has also been a hub of organizing for like, yeah, like, activism that's against, whatever forms of oppression is where like Occupy ended up setting up. But yeah, 6 blocks, it's around like this Cal Anderson Park, and then the 3rd precinct, which was it was a crown jewel of the police department in Seattle. And they, the police set up barricades and defended the precinct from, protesters with, water bottles and umbrellas, using, just a tear gas and mace. And so it was the site of kind of like this stalemate of a standoff between the police and demonstrators who wanted the police out of the neighborhood. And yeah, like, I think it was on Monday was when the police abandoned the precinct and retreated. And this is definitely like a victory for the movement. That they were able to drive out this occupying force that was, had been incredibly violent toward demonstrators in Seattle. As we've seen, this isn't the anomaly, right? This is typical across the country. And so, yeah, when the police retreated, the protesters that had managed to drive them out, kind of, I think this was, taking the area under the ownership of the movement. And so the existing barricades and stuff that they had set up, they just kind of set up that area as like a place where the movement could, there's like people doing art all over the place, and on the plywood boards that buildings have put up around their storefronts and stuff. And, there's like teach-ins and, various kind of, I think it's like twice a day, there's discussions being put forward for the movement to talk about like, what are the demands? How do we win? And so, yeah, like, and, the violence that marked the protests when the police were involved, is completely absent. It's honestly, it's kind of taken on an air kind of like a political festival in a way. There's people playing music, people like just hanging out in the park, and yeah, it's just overall, it's been. I think this is something that the movement secured for itself. Yeah, I can come back on that more if you want.
Thanks, Logan. Yeah, I mean, in Seattle, having a socialist in the city council, it's makes sense that the movement is pushed a little bit further, with Shama Sawant using her seat to put forward actual demands. Can you talk a little bit about what Shama Sawant and Socialist Alternative is putting forward to help the movement?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, having a socialist on city council, that's independent from the Democratic Party and accountable to an organization of working class, nurses and youth and construction workers, right? Like we've been able, demands that have come out from the movement, right, is like defund SPD, community control over the police, investing in communities. And yeah, our council office has taken up those demands, right? Some of them are things that every single budget season since Shama Sawant was elected in 2014, we've politicized it and we've sought to cut the police budget. And so it's a continuation of a position that, as socialists we've maintained. But yeah, so we're calling to cut the SPD funding in half and use that money that's saved to go toward like restorative justice programs and toward things that working people actually need. Because right now, with the budget shortfalls from the pandemic, there's, the establishment politicians are pushing for an austerity budget, but not touching the police department budget. And yeah, like investing in community, right? Like that's a demand coming forward, but, that's, we've been leading a fight to tax Amazon, right? And it's like making big business pay for their crisis of a pandemic, make them pay to reverse gentrification of the, districts that have been historically working class, African-American districts, LGBTQ districts, to build, tax the rich, to build permanently affordable, publicly owned housing. And yeah, for a community control over the police, where, we'd have a democratically elected oversight board that can actually, that would appoint the chief, that would be able to fire officers and subpoena them, and develop the protocols on what they're allowed to do when they police. That you're, to ban things like, putting knees on necks and chokeholds and stuff like that. But yeah, that I think that's in stark contrast from, establishment politicians in other cities where they talk about, completely getting rid of the police when that's not possible under capitalism because the police enforce the inequality that exists. This is seeking to, file down the teeth of the department, put a muzzle on it of, cutting their funding, banning the use of chemical weapons, and bringing them under, democratic oversight from an elected board. Because we acknowledge that, if we tried to just get rid of the police, there's just going to be another body to enforce inequality that steps in its place. It could be the National Guard, it could be private security from companies, but regardless, we'd have to have the same battle all over again to try and get, some degree of accountability, some degree of protocols that limit, how much violence they can inflict, because that's their job under capitalism. So I think it's just that's an honest assessment that we have as Marxists on the function of the police under capitalism.
Thanks so much, Logan. Yeah, and talking about this idea of abolishing the police, we have to keep in mind, like Logan said, under capitalism, there will always be some sort of force that's used against the working class. And we talked a little bit about that with the history of racism, coming out of the evolution of capitalism. I want to play a quick video of something that's pretty, I don't know, I want to call it funny. We're seeing it happen all over the world, of these different statues being pulled down. And it's amazing that these statues are even still up. But here's a quick video of one being pulled down in the UK.
Sorry.
From times of the slave trade, I didn't even realize that some of these existed. In my hometown of Boston, someone beheaded the Christopher Columbus statue and placed the head right next to the body, and then the city had to remove the statue. It was really great, whoever did it. Shout out to you. But I want to talk a little bit with Eric about this quote that we hear so often. You know, Malcolm X is looked at as, you know, one of the most influential leaders of the Black freedom movement here in the US and globally. And we always hear this one quote, and I want to hear what Eric thinks about this. It's that you can't have capitalism without racism. Eric, when someone says that, or someone asks you about that, what do you say to them?
Well, one, I say that it is 100% correct. But two, I will say that we have to remember, looking back at the foundation of capitalism, because capitalism hasn't been around forever, that human beings have different types of societies and different ways of organizing society. And the start of capitalism is not coincidentally the start when we see the exploitation of the so-called New World, the eradication of indigenous peoples, not just here in the Americas, but really around the world as well, like in Africa and in Southeast Asia, etc. And also we see the start of chattel slavery. Why? It wasn't just because like we don't like these people, but they needed a fresh body of labor that did not engage in the class struggles of like the European workers, where they established lines that, you know, you can pay us shitty, but you can't make us wait. You can't make us slaves. They got these bodies, these people, made them into slaves to develop these places where the capitalists can like start planting cotton, sugar, tobacco, etc., make massive amounts of money. Marx said so himself. Marx, as a lot of people don't talk about it, was that he was a rabid anti-slaver. He organized workers, say like in Manchester, to have strikes during the Civil War, where it was the prime minister then and also France that were considering supporting the Confederacy because the South was denying them cotton unless they recognized the Confederacy as a rightful state. And it was the workers, particularly workers that Marx helped organize in Manchester, who made the clothes and stuff from the cotton, said, we're not going to work on Southern cotton, that really forced not only the UK and France to not do these things, to not support the Confederacy, but in order for them to do so, the US, Lincoln, had to say that this war was not about preserving the Union. It was about the ending of slavery. And so that's why you say capitalism cannot happen with racism. Marx said that without slavery, you would not have international finance, that a lot of companies we know, Chase, Bank of America, etc., have roots in slave insurance companies where they insure the slave owners for their slaves. And that's where they got a lot of starting capital. And so it's not even just like a cool slang, it is literally historical fact that really cannot be argued against, that capitalism and racism are the same side. They made two possible, and to really destroy the one, you have to destroy the other. That's it.
Thanks, Eric. I actually, I want to ask a question that Emily in our comment section asked, because it kind of goes off what you're talking about. And it's the idea of Juneteenth. I mean, I'm thrilled that finally this is becoming part of a normal conversation in the US, the acknowledgement of Juneteenth. June 19th was the day the slaves were, that slavery was abolished. And so, Emily's asking, are there next steps to escalate the strength of struggle through a mass strike on Juneteenth? Do you see that as a possibility?
I definitely see that as a possibility, but we have to remember that and it's very unfortunate that the majority of the union leaderships that we have in the United States are very bureaucratic and slow, especially Trumka, basically having this wishy-washy position on Black Lives Matter, getting upset about protesters burning down the AFL-CIO headquarters instead of recognizing that the working class feel disconnected from the largest union really in the world, the most powerful union in the world. It's going to take workers in their unions to really force the leadership. And even if to maneuver around them to say that we need to stand with Black lives, we need to do this general strike on June 19th to show that we stand with the Black working class and that we will say no more Black life in the streets. So I think it's definitely possible, but it will be a struggle, and we have to say that, but I think it's a struggle worth getting into. That even if we don't succeed, we let it be known to the union leaderships that we are not going to take this wishy-washy approach, that we want to be known in the working class, particularly the Black working class, as not just unionized people that fight in the workplace, but also fight outside the workplace too, in the community, and be known as really working class community leaders. So it's really going to take us. We can't wait for anyone else.
Thanks so much, Eric. I want to go now to Phemelo in South Africa. South Africa is an interesting situation where you have, this white minority, capitalist class, and there was a struggle, that happened. Phemelo mentioned a little bit about apartheid, but many people in the U.S., especially young, radicalizing people of color, look towards the idea of Black capitalism, or the idea of putting Black faces in high places, meaning Black CEOs and Black elected politicians, as a way to really liberate Black people. Phemelo, can you talk a little bit about this in the context of South Africa, and how maybe some lessons can be drawn out for Black and brown youth globally?
Thanks, comrade. I think, South Africa is, in this situation, a very unique case. And because police violence here is has a very class nature, as opposed to in the USA, where even a perfect victim could be gunned down by the police. Here it is across class lines. We saw now with lockdown, the beatings and the killings, and even the concentration of soldiers and police was basically in townships, in poor working class communities. We know it's not a mistake that the government actually deployed the army and the police when lockdown was taking place, because they knew about the social unrest that was going to come from it. People have been arrested for crimes of poverty, for standing in long queues to collect food parcels or to buy essential services. So all of these curfews under lockdown that were not compatible with people who are poor, we find them being brutalized by the police. And I think this is the class nature that, South Africa is revealing itself, that even if the police serve only one purpose, which is to stop a threat to the elite. And therefore, even if you do put a black face on the police, some of us were born under a democratic South Africa, but reading about apartheid and actually living life now seems to be the same, because police are actually doing the same things that they did during apartheid. We saw it with Feast Must Fall, where student activists were arrested with ridiculous charges. We saw with the Marikana massacre, which was the first massacre of the ANC under its rule. We see every day how the police is treating workers who are fighting every day. When Ramaphosa became president, he literally enforced those picketing rules, which restrict workers on how they should picket, what they should say, when they should do it. And it was not a mistake also, because it came in conjunction with the stimulus package that was totally anti-working class, and a budget that was totally working class, with anti-working class, with cuts left, right, and center. So they were expecting a social unrest, and thus the police is revealing itself to be there, to be an organ of the state that is meant to, repress the class tensions that arise out of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phemelo. There's so much rich history and a lot to learn, from all of these different struggles around the world. I want to go now to Logan to talk specifically about what the unions are doing. We talked a lot about the need for this international solidarity, but what are unions doing now in the US? I'm thinking of maybe unions like the IBEW, which I know have come out with a statement in certain places. My local certainly hasn't, unfortunately. The nurses, the teachers, even the UFCW, which represents grocery store workers, which now are being called frontline workers. Logan, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. There's been, I think that's a really positive development compared to the Black Lives Matter movement that we saw in like 2015 and 2016, where it seems like labor's really stepping in and taking up the struggle in a way that it didn't, thousands of healthcare workers walk out in support of the justice for George Floyd in Seattle couple Saturdays back. We had the IBEW Local 46 that covers the Seattle area had put out a call to its members saying, they had sat down and coordinated with their signatory contractors that, members could choose to not come out to work because one of the Black Lives Matter organizations in the area had put forward a call for a general strike, and they wanted to honor that. Which, this is definitely, I think that these are those contractors making a concession to the really broad sympathy that working people across the country have to this movement, and the desire to support these calls for justice and equality. But then rank and file action being taken in Minneapolis by ATU bus drivers, led by members of Socialist Alternative, where they would refuse to transport, riot police using the buses to locations where they could go and attack the protesters, and then also refusing to transport protesters who had been detained to jail using public transportation. And then, I'm glad you brought up the Juneteenth. The ILWU, which is the West Coast Longshore Union, is shutting down all ports on the West Coast under their jurisdiction on June 19th. And they're leading actions in the various port cities that they're in, leading marches and demonstrations. And it's looking like they're trying to link up with the ILA, which is the International Longshore Association that covers kind of the Eastern Seaboard and Gulf, to have a joint action, which I think would be the first time that they coordinated that, if I remember correctly, which would be really powerful. And I've heard rumors also of Liverpool joining in, which would make it an international action, which I think points to the direction that these struggles need to take. There's a bunch of trade union activists like myself and other members of Socialist Alternative and across the country that are trying to build, working class fight back, supporting this. In Seattle, we've got a call to expel the Police Officers Guild from our labor council. Because the role of the police, as we talked about, an organization that defends those officers committing acts of violence is incompatible with the purpose of our labor unions, which is to defend and advance the interests of every worker. I can follow up on that if you want, but stop there.
Thanks so much, Logan. Super inspirational, especially the longshoremen, the dock workers. They're some of the most powerful people in the world. Considering what it is they do, they bring in all the products into the country. So that's really inspiring. We have time for one more question. This question's from Peter in Germany, and I'm going to have Eric answer this for us. So Peter asks, how are International Socialist Alternative, which in the U.S. is called Socialist Alternative, how are the demands and the program being received at the protests?
Well, we just had a rally and march in Philadelphia with around 2,000 to 3,000 people that was hosted by SA and a coalition of other organizations. And people responded very positively to our demands. People understood that any talk about abolishing police, about abolishing capitalism is happy talk, and people are willing to go all the way. There's a sense of the old world is dead, the new is not yet born, and we have to struggle. And also a very important note, we went after Joe Biden. We said, do not, this whole talk about vote blue no matter who is meaningless if we're in a city that's democratically controlled from the bottom to the top and they're tear gassing us. Why are they saying to vote for Joe Biden? And I think that got roaring applause. So I think we're definitely getting a note that the working class has learned from the past and saying we're not going to allow this thing to happen. You guys have played this trick over and over again, and we're not going to take it anymore.
Thanks, Eric, so much. And I want to thank all of our speakers for participating with us today. It's super important to have this truly international discussion about the fight against racism and police brutality. So now we're going to our shout out of the week. And this shout out goes to International Socialist Alternative in Mexico, which is called Alternativa Socialista, and the campaign to free Susana Preto. The fight against police brutality and against for workers' rights, where, you know, as we discussed, is happening all over the world. We even had Adan from Mexico comment saying about the police murder of Giovanni Lopez in the Jalisco state. So this movement is, you know, really global, as we talked about. But the campaign that they're working on is for the release of Susanna, who is an advocate for the National Independent Union of Workers of Industries and Services, that's a mouthful, which represents workers in northern Mexico near the US border. You know, this section of the country has extremely terrible conditions because it's this special economic zone. And the bosses here have been exposed for not following guidelines and putting workers in danger, especially during this COVID crisis. So, you know, this advocate lawyer was arrested, and Alternativa Socialista demands the immediate and unconditional release of Susanna, accused of false crimes with the intention of intimidating and demobilizing workers. So shout out to them, keep up the great work. And if you're in Mexico and you want to join with this fight, please check out our website. I want to end our show today from a comment from Yara. And she says that the international connection is absolutely essential in this movement. Racism is an international issue. It's a systematic issue inherent to international capitalism. The only way to tear down racism is to work internationally and get rid of capitalism. If you agree with Yara and you agree with the speakers on this panel today, please consider joining the International Socialist Alternative. I'll see everyone next week, same time, same place. Thanks for watching.